Brad Edwards, welcome to the Christian Bitcoin Podcast. I'm Tim Fox, Executive Director of the Magnalia Foundation. Excited today to have Brad with us. He's a fellow PCA pastor. Brad, could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and where you are? And then we'll jump in a little bit to your story with Bitcoin and talk more broadly about ministry and technology from there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, man. It's, longtime listener, first time caller and all that. I'm in Lafayette, Colorado. And if you don't know where Lafayette is, we're basically one of the smaller cities and towns that surround the city of Boulder, or as I like to call it, the People's Republic of Boulder. And we've been planting the Table Church here since we launched weekly worship services 2 Sundays before the 2016 presidential election. So it's been a wild roller coaster of a ride. And so we're coming up on our 10th anniversary in August. And like I said, it's been a wild ride, and we are but in the best place we've ever been. It's a really cool, thing. So,
are you from Colorado?
No, I'm from the Midwest. I kind of was born in DC, but my dad was a veteran. And so I basically grew up in St. Louis, though, because he transferred to Scott Air Force Base when I was like three and a half, something like that. But I've been in Colorado now for, it's been over 14 years. So it certainly feels like home, but I'm not from here, just like most Coloradans now is not natives.
All right. Yeah, no, I'm in Utah, and it's the same kind of thing here for a lot of us. Okay. So your church is doing the same thing that my church is doing here in Utah. You are officially becoming your own self-sustaining church. You're training leaders. We've been doing a little bit of discussion lately on our podcast about leadership and kind of emotional health and some of that stuff. But you and I connected originally last year about Bitcoin. You had kind of been a quiet Bitcoin interested lurker out there and had reached out just saying, hey, this is interesting what you guys are doing. You had framed it in terms of church planting and especially church real estate. Tell us a little bit about some of the challenges you've come across with money and finance and economics as it relates to the church and especially young churches.
Yeah, I mean, if you know anything about Colorado, or I imagine a very similar story in Utah and many parts of the West, there are the cost of living here it's obscene. Boulder has, I think, is the smallest city on the list of median $1 million housing market. So like $1 million in Boulder will get you like a 2-bed, 1-bath, 1,100 square foot in need of repair. Like it's bonkers. And Lafayette isn't that bad, but it's not by a whole lot. We've seen housing prices more than double in the last 10 years. And it wasn't cheap to begin with. So it's definitely a challenge, just like personally, financially. We were able to afford bringing on another pastor, Michael Phillips, largely in part because he already bought a house in Atlanta and is renting that for a little bit of extra income to close the gap. It really does make ministry more challenging. We have to pay our staff. We're glad to pay our staff, a lot more than the average, but you just have to, in order for them to spend, a quarter or half of their, be quarter or half time in a place that's expensive. And we've even I actually looked at not too long ago that pre-pandemic, we probably had, I would say 45% of our families, just under half, were double income with kids. And now I can think of 1 or 2 families who are not double income, either with kids or without.
Just because it's so expensive just to make it.
Yeah,
it's really expensive. Do you find as in your pastoral ministry and just discipleship of people, what are some ways that money and stress about money and how far money goes or doesn't go, how does that factor into your ministry?
Yeah, the biggest part is just, especially, this came to a head during the pandemic, right? Because right before the pandemic, we were meeting in a public school in Boulder Valley School District. And when we were trying to regather and reach back out to them once the restrictions lifted, and which was really, really a long time. And those restrictions lasted a lot longer than most areas of the country.
Right.
The school district told us yeah, we're good, thanks. It didn't say, no, we won't, but they made it so hard, it was clear they were trying to basically communicate that without breaking any laws. And so it took us another 6 months to find a building, and it was that we could meet in. And the only reason we did was because the owner of the building was pre-pandemic renting it out for about $13,000 a month, and just to stop the hemorrhaging, we rented it from him for about $5,000 a month, and that was like a lot more more expensive for us, but it kind of kept him afloat until he sold it. And then when we sold it, we were about 2 months away from being homeless, because there's no it's hard to describe, but like in Boulder County, like Lafayette is a former coal mining town, so the buildings and the architecture in a place with weather like this, both historically and geographically, there are not many large buildings. I mean, there's storefronts, but they could maybe hold 100 people, and we were about 120, so it just didn't work. We finally found a building. It's actually a church building owned by a church that meets in a newer building they built behind this one, and it's a great thing. And we have like a long-term lease, but the cost of real estate here, if we were to like find some land and build a church, just back of napkin estimate, if we were going to build a church that we could actually grow into still, let's say it could seat like 250 to 300, it would be somewhere between $5 and $8 million. And for a church that's currently, we're about 150 on a Sunday, like that's exorbitant and way out of reach. And so we've had to think critically about like how in the world, and also because it's such a de-churched area, there are 35 PCA churches in our presbytery, but that presbytery stretches from Colorado Springs all the way up to Billings, Montana. So 3 of the bigger states in the union. And so there's not a concentration of churches that can help fund or resource that kind of thing to do the fundraising. And so you put all this together, and it's just like, I think the last church in our presbytery that bought property was something like, I think it was over 25 years ago. And we've planted 7 or 8 churches in that time, and have another 7, 8, 9 that are like in the hopper in the process of being planted. So that means we've got to get creative. And so one of those ways, and why we're talking on this podcast, was I started exploring and reached out to you guys because I'm trying to think what are the untapped fundraising either vehicles and or communities that we could maybe tap into. And I reached out thinking and suspecting that, Bitcoiners wanting to see some proof of concept and prove that Bitcoin can be helpful especially for Christians and for churches. Like, what would it look like? How do we actually get set up to receive Bitcoin donations? And could that be a fundraising avenue where we could hold it? And even as Bitcoin appreciates, being able to leverage that for purchasing a building.
And Bitcoin is infamously very volatile, and it is somewhat down this year, more than people were hoping it would be. But on average, Bitcoin is one of the best performing assets out there, maybe the best. And so, there is this idea of Bitcoin becoming a kind of endowment type thing that, and again, we always tell people, don't put money into this that you're going to need in the next few years, because you'll get whipped around really bad and it'll scare you. But it could become something that could help churches like yours.
And if we were not depending on it for our annual budget and paying staff or anything like that, but if it was just like we know we need to start a nest egg now, even before we have a plan for a building or like any kind of a pitch to the congregation or to other churches across the country, like if we had a bit of a reserve there that we could like demonstrate, like, hey, we've been thinking ahead about this. We are trustworthy for you to invest in, and we're not using Bitcoin because it's volatile for our annual budget. Like that, I feel like would both be a potential fundraising stream, but also kind of demonstrate that we are serious about this and not just looking for a handout. So there are multiple, I think, really good reasons for it. So
and so this last year at what we call our General Assembly, which is the annual meeting of the PCA pastors and elders. This last year, there was an overture that came to the General Assembly, encouraging everyone to look into Bitcoin and to study it. This being one of the reasons, among other reasons. And a lot of the pushback that we heard was, "Why are we talking about this? This is not spiritual. This doesn't have to do with the mission of the church. We shouldn't be talking about something like this." You, as a church planter in a very expensive city in America, are feeling very acutely the ways that financial issues and economic issues affect your people.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to somebody who says it's unspiritual or it's suspicious to be talking about money and finance as a pastor or in a church?
Well, I mean, especially since we're talking about the building, it reminds me of the comment that just drives me nuts every time I hear it, which is the church is not a building, it's a community. And two observations about that I think that are relevant. One, I've never heard that from somebody who was part of a church that didn't own a building already. And so
Right.
I've yet to hear it from somebody who's like local, because my first response would be like, well, if you really believe that, then let's step out in faith and hand me the keys, because we could totally use that building. But the second part is like, I just don't think people have an appreciation or a realization just how much the fundraising and church planting cost picture has changed. Like, we are not looking at,
Right.
I mean, when I first moved to Colorado, like I said, about 14 years ago, the kind of standard expectations that would be like 3 or 4 years to plant a church. By the time I actually was in a place to plant, that had improved a little bit to like, 4 to 5, maybe 6 years to plant a church. At each phase, we're about 3 or 4 years behind the curve. I think planting in Boulder County, like even if you took out the pandemic, it still would have taken us, we might have only particularized this last fall in about 9 years, because it just
Right.
takes that long to, in a place that's so unchurched, from people who are coming here from across the country. By definition, they value like pursuing whatever, maybe the Colorado lifestyle or their careers. They value that more than the community that they left. Otherwise, they wouldn't have moved here. And so there's a discipleship challenge of having to teach people about giving, and how that is actually, that invitation from Jesus is actually a gift and a blessing. And
Right.
so if we're talking about like, okay, how does that translate to Bitcoin? I think there's a real danger that if we're not actually exploring this and talking about it, then we're actually implicitly communicating to people that this is an exception to Jesus's encouragement to be generous toward the local church, right? So I think you, it's not the difference between like saying something versus saying nothing. It's what are we communicating by saying nothing or something?
Right.
So,
Right. And I think one of the drums that Bitcoiners like to bang on is this whole issue of how broken our monetary system is and how many effects that has downstream. Because they make the good point that money is one of the most important facets of our lives in terms of how much it affects our interactions with each other. It's kind of, it's the grease that makes it possible for people to trade with each other, to work with each other, to live with each other, to move around, to do all these things that we're talking about. And so if the money itself is messed up, if something's wrong with it, if something is dysfunctional, if something's immoral about it, it's going to have all kinds of really bad effects. Now, Bitcoiners can tend to be overly optimistic and idealistic about how straightforward it will be once Bitcoin fixes all those problems, and everything else will just be wonderful and gravy. And as pastors, we say, well, money is a big problem, but it's not the worst problem. And there's a lot of really serious things that money can't fix.
Yeah, I mean, I think in describing Bitcoin as a volatile asset is accurate, but it is less volatile compared to fiat currency than it used to be. And I think that's part of your point there, is that, like, I mean, I think the argument that persuaded me in terms of like, not just pastorally, in terms of like for pragmatic reasons for our church, the part where I found personally most convincing was the reality that, the Fed printing money is a functional tax that doesn't require Congress to take responsibility. And if there's anything that is more frustrating politically for me right now, it's the way that Congress has completely abdicated its responsibility and authority and power, and how much the executive branch has just grown, just exploded in power and autonomy in ways that the founders never intended. And I think fiat currency and the way the Fed, I want to be careful, because I don't want to imply that the Fed is in some ways like doing something maliciously, like twirling their mustaches like I have. Like, I don't think that that's the case, but I think that the incentives and the pressures are all aligned toward that end, whether they intend to or not.
Right. Yeah. And it's, as Christians, we're not surprised by something like that, because given our doctrine of sin, we are not surprised that sin is a lot more than just individual conscious decisions. And sometimes I get a little bit nervous when people start talking about systemic sin, because I think that can be abused and it can be taken in some pretty weird, unbiblical directions. But there is a significant element of truth to it, that sin and evil can be something that is bigger than the sum of the parts, so to speak. And then you bring in kind of the doctrine of demons and, the world and the spiritual forces out there. You kind of mix all these things together, and it's like, and again, and this has been running for over 100 years, and it's like there's no one person that you can blame for any of this. There's no 20 people that you can blame for any of this. It's just kind of this self-perpetuating system. And there's a lot of people in it who have very good intentions and are good, even godly people who are doing what they think God's called them to do, and they're working hard. But the net result is something's really broken. And I think one of the things that I've noticed with Bitcoin and people is, even if they're skeptical of Bitcoin itself and they're like, well, I don't know, this is some new technology, or I don't know, it's so volatile. Most people, I think, can pretty quickly sense that, and they already kind of know something's wrong. Something's wrong with our money. Something's wrong with our world. Things are not supposed to be this way. And you see it even I've noticed within a church, you see it across generations, where the older people in the church, again, I'm not at all a fan of taking, a big dump on the boomers and blaming them for everything. I think that we can be really unfair about that. But I'd be curious to hear you speak about this. There is, I think, this tension of younger people and older people, and how hard is it to buy a house today compared to the median income, versus 50 years ago, things like that. To where I think sometimes older people, in their frustration with younger people, like, oh, you're being lazy, or you're being a whiners, or whatever. It's like, well, there are some unique challenges today, and these problems have been going on for a long time. It was going on 50 years ago, but it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. You know what I'm saying? Do you see that in your community? And
yeah, no, I mean, I'm. It's our church. We're preaching through. We started the first of the year preaching through Jonah, and then moving on to the first 7 chapters of Daniel. And so, like, kind of having this conversation, like, what does it look like to live faithfully in exile, and how does God meet us in that place and give us just truckloads of grace for it in ways that don't make sense and are often surprising and counterintuitive. And I think as part of that, and just even apart from that, I'm constantly talking to our people about how, like, we need to more fully understand and appreciate just how much the earth has moved underneath us over the last, I'd say probably 12 or 15 years. And I write about this in my book around social media, but I don't think that's the only way that has been shifting. Like I think it was Tim Keller who talked about how we've been in a post-Christian culture for a long time in terms of the software of culture, but the hardware of culture, which is the institutions, that was really what social media most affected and kind of hijacked the incentives within institutions, and also our incentives for being a part of institutions in the first place. It turned them inside out, turned it from responsibility to performance, if you read Levin it all. And that change was a post-Christian hardware shift. And so it hits differently now in ways that the conditions are completely different on the ground than they were when boomers were, in their 30s and 40s and climbing the corporate ladder. And it really did just genuinely take a lot of hard work, but it was still possible with hard work. And but the conditions have changed, and that isn't an excuse for millennials to be entitled. And I'm a Zennial, so I like to say I have a foot in the best of both worlds of Gen X and millennial. But I think that is totally true. And it's interesting, kind of anecdotally, I've noticed that there are 2 types of growing churches: those with Gen X, some Gen X and boomers, and those that are younger. And I think increasingly we're seeing a significant disconnect of generational diversity within congregations, especially if that church is growing. It's generally because it is either aware of those conditions being changed, or it's not aware of those conditions being changed. I think that's I think there's, again, anecdotally, I don't have any data to point that to back that up, but just from conversations I've had with a lot of pastors. But yeah, culturally, economically, so like a huge part of this conversation I don't hear a whole lot about is like social status. Like what do we aspire to now in terms of, like, okay, if workaholism and the white picket fence is no longer the aspiration, I think millennials have been burnt out on, like, trying to change the world as we used to in the early teens and aughts. Like, when I talk to people who move here from somewhere else, when I ask them, like, what do you aspire to? Like, I haven't heard a good answer in a long time. In fact, it's almost as if people aren't asking the question anymore because they're not sure what that answer would be. So we kind of avoid the question. So I think
Like
there's a lot to
trying
that.
to survive or kind of minimize suffering, or what? Like what?
He's trying to survive. I think part of it, like if you get the job that you need to be able to move to Colorado, you're just stoked that is the case, and you're just grateful, and you busted your butt to get there. But part of the there's a timeline once you move to Colorado where it takes somewhere between, depending on where you're moving from, like 1 to 3 years to experience the culture shock of like, this is not actually, like in a very Ecclesiastes kind of way, like not satisfying in the ways that I expected it to be.
Right.
Some of that is
it promises a lot at the beginning as this great, beautiful, awesome lifestyle.
Yeah. And let me tell you, it's one thing to be disappointed by reality. It's another thing to be disappointed by your utopia. So like that culture, it's real. And all the time that you're like you're hitting that point of like realizing that that's not going to satisfy, that entire time it's getting more expensive to live here. And as that goes, you increase at the same time you're getting closer, it's getting punted farther away because you don't even have the time to think about that difference and accept that and grieve it and then move on and build on it. So it's a bit of a pressure cooker in a lot of ways. So yeah, you need a refuge.
So you're preaching. You said you're preaching through Daniel. You know, the background of this, of course, is that God's people are in exile in Babylon, and you're navigating when the world does this mean I'm completely unmoored from everything I know. No temple, no home. What are we doing? We've chatted some. You've written some about the technological shifts that have happened as a significant part of this new world we're living in, this kind of sense of being unmoored and exiled. You've already mentioned a little bit about social media, but talk to us a little bit about how technology factors into this. Things like, because Bitcoin is part of this. I think part of the reason why people are somewhat skeptical of Bitcoin sometimes is like, well, it's this new thing and I don't totally understand it. Is it just like all this other crazy stuff I've heard about? There's a lot of overlap and interest between Bitcoin people and the people that are interested in AI now and internet, computers, engineer-related things. How has that affected your ministry, and how are you helping your people walk through these huge changes that are going on technologically right now, especially with AI?
Yeah, I think that my primary short-term goal is just to help people not be surprised by change. Change is going to be hard no matter what it is. Technology, I don't know if I got this from somewhere else. If I did, I don't remember who it was from. But like technology, especially novel technology or new technology, is a plausibility structure, right? Using it shifts the horizon of what you think is possible or impossible. And so part of how social media has affected that is, well, the way I normally introduce it for pastors especially is you probably noticed that somewhere between 2013, 2015, that the typical visitor coming through the front doors of your church went from expecting to be shaped and formed by that church to expecting that church to be shaped and formed by them, right? And because that is because social media is, to quote Samuel James, is a digital liturgy that is shaping our affections and our expectations and our aspirations. And so now, as pastors, we love to complain about, people will, pull open their social media app, 100 times every time they pull up their Bible app one time, right? And so it's hard to compete with that. In fact, it's actually impossible unless you're able to inoculate people and help them see and understand, like, this is how using this technology is shaping you in perverse ways that you are not even aware of at the time. It's not obvious from how social media is marketed to you, but also it happens so slowly that it's, like the proverbial frog in the pot of water brought slowly to a boil, right? You don't know to jump out until you're already boiled alive. And that is the Silicon Valley way. Whether it's social media or something else, you get people hooked on subscriptions when it's cheap, and then gradually ratchet up the price and take away the perks until you're squeezing them for more and more dollars because venture capitalists have been able to fund it and float them for years of unprofitability first. So it's a I agree with you about, like, we want to be like hesitant to just like jump to systemic sin, but systems, whether we're talking about an economic system or an institution or a social or political system, like, they are always a mix of restrictions and incentives that either make godliness and faithfulness easier or harder. And social media is a good example of one that makes it significantly harder, because it's the entire point of social media is to mine and extract your attention, which is the currency of worship. So if we are giving all of our attention, because your attention is finite, you don't have an infinite amount of attention. I think, was it Tristan Harris maybe, who said that, like, if the product is free, you're the product.
Right.
That's actually what's happening. And so becoming aware of that helps decrease like our temptation and our desire to use it, because we're now choosing to be manipulated. And I think that's at least a very necessary first step to helping people realize that. So
obviously everyone is different and every situation is different. And I'm sure you're careful to not give blanket prescriptions to every single person in your church. But in general terms, what are the kind of basic pieces that you would want to communicate to people in your church if they came to you and said, Pastor Brad, help me think through how to relate to my phone? What are some, or social media, what are kind of the basic things you want to say? Hey, I want you to watch out for this, or maybe you should think about this. What are some of those big signposts you want to put out for people?
I mean, like, I think any kind of change of habit that's not first met with an awareness of like seeing reality more clearly is probably it's not going to stick. And so, like a good Presbyterian pastor, I typically recommend a few books, specifically Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation.
Right. Yeah, I just read that a few months ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's good in a really depressing and like I hopefully won't cut myself kind of way. But that and I think Samuel James's Digital Liturgies actually is very much like The Anxious Generation in terms of understanding what social media and technological, like use of technology, is doing to us. But he also casts a really positive, beautiful vision for like, here's how you can not be shaped and deformed by this.
Right.
And if you don't like books, then just go watch the Social Dilemma with Tristan Harris, because that's really helpful. But in terms of, I mean, I think Andy Crouch has some really good advice on, having technological Sabbaths, an hour a day and a day a week and a week a month, maybe a month a year. Like just start small, like an hour a day, and then kind of keep going and keep building on that. And I think that building those habits slowly, understanding why you're doing it, and having not just like a negative vision, but a positive vision of what you're aiming for, and not just what you're trying to resist. Because if there's anything about exile in Jonah and Daniel that is worth pulling out, it's that these exiles would not survive, never mind remain faithful, without worship of the one true God, and being enraptured by that. So we're not captured by empire and a post-Christian culture.
Right. How do you, the second half of Daniel is very similar to the book of Revelation and other parts of the Bible, where it's this heavily, we call it apocalyptic, where it's this amazing, visionary, wild kind of kaleidoscopic depictions of what God is doing in history. What is it about that kind of literature in the Bible you think that helps us navigate times of immense change and disconnection?
Oh man. Well, I'll tell you where my head's been going, and this is I don't think I've said this out loud yet, but I think we have been moving in a direction culturally that's not just post-Christian, but it's increasingly post-secular, in the sense that we are not, like, we're recovering an awareness and appreciation of the spiritual realm, and that everything isn't just like this materialistic reality that we see, that there are unseen things. And in a weird way, the digital life that we now have to live in, like even now doing this on, Riverside instead of in person, like has given us an awareness of like, yeah, the spiritual world is a little bit like the difference between material and spiritual is a little bit like analog and spiritual and digital in some ways. But I think that you put that with the deformation of technology that we're going through, and it's coming out really Gnostic. And so what I think is beautiful about Scripture is it ruthlessly, even if implicitly, makes it clear that the material and the spiritual are linked, and that what you do with tangible things is shaping and forming of you spiritually as well. That these are not separate, that these are actually united, because shalom and human flourishing has to include both. Otherwise, like, God would not encourage his people to still, like in Jeremiah 27, right? Plant gardens, give your sons and daughters away in marriage, seek the peace and the shalom. Yeah, while you're in exile, in the city that I have placed you, right? And so part of what needs to happen there is to just accept that, like, to accept the change. That, like, even though it's funny, in Colorado, some people, most people move here from somewhere else. So there is a change of scenery. But digitally, even if you haven't moved to Colorado, you're experiencing a change of scenery without a change in location.
Right.
And that's weird. And being able to name that and say, you know what, this is the world we live in. There's no necessarily going back to the way things were, because we still have to exist in Babylon. So let's get over the fact that we can't go back to Jerusalem. But in accepting that, the point of accepting that isn't like despair. It's actually being freed to embrace faithfulness in a new and different way. And what does that look like?
Right. So do you, with something like social media, or maybe especially now AI, do you view these as it's just one more tool, and you can use tools for good things or for bad things, but in and of themselves, they're just kind of neutral? Or are some of these technologies so potent or so dark that, no, this is in a different category now? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, I think if technology...
I'm not sure. I'm genuinely asking. I wrestle with this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if a new technology introduces a new plausibility structure, then it's at least not neutral. I mean, I think the idea that technology is neutral is one of the dumbest inventions of the 20th century. We even have phrases that communicate the exact opposite, because if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right? So that's not a neutral thing. It shapes and forms how you see the world, right? So as far as AI goes, I think I used to be pretty Skynet adjacent about it, and I still am extremely skeptical of how AI use is shaping people. And there's all kinds of studies now that cognitively you suffer a negative effect of frequent AI use. Right. But I think that there are, like, to kind of zoom out a little bit, I've been kind of operating off of my own, like, taxonomy of different ways of using AI that I think can be more positive or more negative, right? I think, when we're talking about automating things, depending on what we're talking about, like, that could be a really good thing. Being able to automate, as long as it's not hallucinating, like, that's not a great thing. If AI is hallucinating and you've entrusted it to automate traffic lights, that's going to be that's going to go bad, right? So I'm talking about, like, the ideal, right?
Right.
Automation, I can see automating infrastructure. I can see that could be a really positive thing. Akin to the 20th century building of the interstate highway system. I can see that being really good, right? Then there's the category of, like, research and academic use or scientific use, trying to find new cures for cancer, that kind of a thing. Like, I'm all in on that. Like, I think that's great. I've got some worries about, like, Silicon Valley transhumanism that's informing some of the design, and therefore downstream could be influential, but that's a question of how, not whether, to use it for that purpose, right? Then there is the glorified Google search use of AI, which is, like, that gets a little bit murky for me, because I think you could argue, like, I mean, I was just telling somebody in our church the other day who just moved into a new place that I put their address in Google Maps, but did not click start to have it tell me where to go. I was looking at the map and trying to, like, figure it out the old school way, as if it was paper. Right. And then I was, like, trying to like come up with an acronym in my head on which streets to turn in which direction, because I'm trying to resist the cognitive offloading.
Totally outsourcing everything.
Yes, because neurologically, like, when your brain is functionally told, like, oh, you don't have to remember this anymore, because it's that information and that knowledge is being stored externally, your brain will be like, okay, I will not. I've got other things I got to remember. So, like, that's formation right there. Like, what are we forgetting?
Yeah, I mean, this is the famous part in Plato thousands of years ago, where he's like, whoa, if we have books, people aren't going to remember anything anymore. I don't know about writing things down in books.
Well, what's fun, it's interesting. I don't know if you follow Derek Thompson, but he's a former staff writer from The Atlantic. He just had a podcast episode. I can't remember the name of his guest, but he wrote a book that's basically arguing that that we part of like he argued like 99% of like our political and social dysfunction and turmoil we're experiencing right now is the result of us moving from a literate culture to an oral culture. And because oral cultures were, they needed to remember symbols more than they needed to remember, the exact details of a story. So it's less evidence-based and it's more meaning-based. So there's a longing for meaning there. But book culture, literary cultures, it was the creation and the distribution, the ability to access books because the printing press that we started to develop calculus. Right? Because you could write down and not have to keep in your brain these things, and you could build on them and think rationally and linearly. And so the combination of like first the internet and the cognitive offloading of like you can access this anytime, you don't need to remember it. Then social media, which like supercharged that because now it's not just a one-way receiving of information, it's bi-directional, right? Social media is like digital storytelling where everyone caught the biggest fish. Right, like it's an oral culture, cultural artifact, and a plausibility structure. I think AI is probably already accelerating that even further. Because
in what way?
For the reasons you're talking, like it's the cognitive offloading. But it's a weird kind of oral culture that we're seeing emerge because it doesn't require like commiserating. It doesn't require dialogue with actual human beings. It just requires a synthetic facsimile of discussion. And depending on how that algorithm and that AI is trained, that could have massive effects, right?
Formatively. It's like the social media stuff, like you said, you don't realize how it's shaping you, but it is. And, this whole issue with the AI things of, what do they call it? The sycophantism. It's constantly kind of telling you what you want to hear. Oh, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And, that's like, as a pastor, it's like, that's like the worst possible thing for people to be hearing constantly is like, you're absolutely right. I just keep going, whatever you want to do. And it's like, man, that's not what I need to hear. I need to hear like correction. The wise man loves to be corrected, not told, oh, you're great. Keep going.
I mean, Helen Lewis, who journalist for the BBC, and we've had on the podcast I co-host, Post Everything with John Homus. Like we've had her on twice to talk about the various podcast projects she does, and one of them, which was just brilliant, was all about the way frictionless communication is shaping our expectations of human relationships. And so if all you do is talk to people on Slack all day, then you're used to being able to like step away from a conversation and come back to it. Like asynchronous communication makes us less patient for synchronous communication. Like we become accustomed and conditioned by it. So that becomes more uncomfortable and we lose like the basic foundations for things like conflict resolution or repentance and forgiveness. And like actually in our the elder training we just did last night. We were talking before we hit record that we're in our first round of elder training as a church plant trying to become a real church. That somebody said like, okay, this shepherding stuff, like this is all really good, but how do we do this how do we teach people how to be Christians when we also have to teach them to be human first? And I was like, I mean, that question summarized exactly the way that technology and especially AI is challenging ministry in ways that we have not had to think about ever before. And it actually is really new territory.
Yeah. And people are starting, especially younger people in some ways, starting from so far back in a lot of ways, not just, I'm not even talking about like Bible knowledge, okay, that's a whole nother thing. Just kind of that, okay, you got to learn a bunch of stuff. Like this is just like basic social functioning and relationships. And like you said, conflict resolution, which is like, that's so much of life is learning how to deal with that. And if you're in a highly technological society, which we've been in for a long time, on top of the fact that American culture is already very much pragmatic, we can fix everything, just throw money and time at it and every problem can be solved. And then you add the whole technological level to that. People just are conditioned to think, well, everything can be solved and everything can be fixed. And when it can't, it's your problem. It's not my problem. I'm out of here. And
Mhm.
how do you help people walk through frustration and disappointment? I mean, it's the Ecclesiastes thing you're talking about, that so much of life is vanity, and there is so much of it that is unsatisfying, and there's nothing you can do about it. And there's so many problems, not just as a pastor, just in life, that you just can't fix. And there's so many people that you just can't fix. And that's just what it is. And God in his wisdom has built us that way in a fallen world.
Well, and that massive cultural shift that you just summarized is why I wrote The Reason for Church, because I was trying to figure out and grapple with, like, I really thought that, like, planting a church, the challenge was just kind of convincing people to tolerate the church long enough that they'd fall in love with Jesus. What I didn't understand is that not only do they see the church as not something to tolerate, but something that's, like, inherently harmful and dehumanizing. Right. And even if that isn't like consciously thought or articulated, that is the baseline default assumption of a culture that's as individualistic as ours. And it was really like, writing that book was an attempt to both me figure out, but also to explain that, like, our abandoning of institutions in general, not just the church, has conditioned and taught the youngest generation, our kids, that the institutions are a means to your end and not an opportunity to be a part of something that's bigger than yourself and to experience a meaning that's deeper than you could find on your own. And that it requires something more than just generic community or, a bowling league or something like that, right? That requires a combination of community, ritual, meaning, and purpose that we are being shaped by and toward. Otherwise, like, it's actually really despairing to be the author of your own story. That's a burden that we, like human beings in our nature, we're not meant to ever be able to carry, and is way bigger than, like, no character can write his own story in any book.
Right. Only God can bear that weight.
Yep.
To be the author.
And perfecter.
So, I mean, you wrote this whole wonderful book, making the case for church in a world where people at best shrug their shoulders at it. Mm-hmm. Really, it's a lot worse than that. What is your basic kind of case for why you should care about church in a world where technology is promising you so much, and there's at least the surface appearance of, you don't need this and you can be fine in it. People seem to be good doing their Sunday brunches with their buddies and all that kind of stuff. Why should we care about church in a highly technological age?
I mean, what I tried to do in the book too was not start with, like, well, how God would answer that question, because in a lot of ways we're not even persuaded that he exists, or that that's not something that's maybe dated and just doesn't apply anymore because we have technology, right? So like, my argument is that, people going out to brunch are actually not okay. Right. And that is in a lot of ways a way of trying to manage symptoms of what I think Alan Noble, I heard him describe as that, like, we are living in an environment that is increasingly inhumane and inhospitable to human flourishing. And that is the combination of, like, incentives and restrictions we were talking about, and the way that digital technology is, like, when when I'm talking about, like, shifting the horizons of what's possible and impossible, like, it's the possible, like, it's easy to see, like, what, AI could potentially do for us. But the impossible is, like, well, if it can do that for us, then I don't need this. So our horizon is shrinking institutionally and relationally. And so part of what I tried to do in the book is just to say, like, these things that we are putting our hope in do not deliver on what they promise. And that you've experienced it, but let me actually connect the dots for you a little bit, because you're not crazy for feeling that way. And it's actually more problematic than you even think or feel right now. And so each of the first chapters in the first half of the book are a different, like, church defeater, which I'm kind of riffing off of Tim Keller's defeater beliefs, which are cultural assumptions that we take on the basis of faith that preclude belief in God. Well, these are cultural assumptions that we have just inherited, either growing up in the U.S. at this time and place, and or because we're using digital technology, that preclude or make implausible, or if not impossible, the idea of ever committing and being fully involved in a church. And that could be, like, people on the outside of the church. It could be people in the church. Like, I feel like there's a low ceiling for belonging here. It's like, you're probably right. Put down the phone. It's not that simple, but like there are reasons outside of this church that are affecting the way that you're seeing this church. And just being able to connect those dots and paint a picture of that, I think was the goal there. But in terms of, like, I think the primary metaphor I use in the second half that I think is really helpful is if our environment is increasingly inhospitable to human flourishing, then we need a greenhouse, right? If like the environment around is not ideal for a plant, then we build an ecosystem for them that where they can be fertilized and watered and yes, even pruned. And pruning hurts sometimes, but it's how we bear fruit, which is another way of saying we flourish. And so, we need these spiritual greenhouses, and God's given us this spiritual greenhouse, a redemptive spiritual greenhouse in the church. And it's the only institution that can do that. Even if there are other kinds of greenhouses that are also good socially, but they can't do spiritually or redemptively what the church does.
Right. There may be a temptation in that and I think this has been common in American church life, to kind of overpromise and underdeliver. Like, oh, we're going to fix everything. It's going to be great. This is going to be the best community ever. It's going to be the most fun thing you've ever been to. We're going to, completely and utterly transform this city. And it's like, church in a lot of ways, it is disappointing and it is frustrating, and the people in it are sinners still. And so it's like there is an element, you can understand why people would not like church, because there are a lot of problems with it. But I went back and I reread Dietrich Bonhoeffer's little book on community a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And I've just been chewing on that section where he talks about how it's God's gift to be disappointed not only with yourself, but with other Christians. Because when you learn to kind of accept the community for what it actually is that God's given you, then you can actually grow into it instead of demanding and expecting it to be this great, wonderful ideal. How do you thread that needle in the midst of this inhumane society? How do you avoid the temptation to promise a church community that's going to solve every single problem for you and be this great ideal? Do you know what I mean?
I try to cast a vision for the church that requires death in order to experience resurrection, because I think that's the only gospel saturated vision of a church that we can responsibly cast. I think there are all kinds of ways where it's very easy to accidentally overpromise and underdeliver, because right now, like, if you could probably trace most of our political fights as competing visions of utopias, and we blame the other person, the other side, for our not being able to reach it. And if we just elect the right people, then it'll work. Well, we've been promised that for many election cycles now, and it's still not happening. So I don't know, maybe that's a bad idea. But in casting a vision for a church, it doesn't mean, well, let me back up. Let me say it this way. One of the things, second only to the church isn't a building, it's a community, that drives me nuts is when I hear someone describe a church as too institutional. Because I'm like, okay, when you use that word, what do you mean by that? And normally they say, like, it just feels like, it's like maybe all about money and trying to like grow for the sake of its own growth. And, like, yes, mission is there, but like, I don't feel very known. I feel like it's just kind of a cog in the machine. And I'm like, okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Because that's not, that's not too institutional. That's not institutional enough. That's too corporate. That is, I talk about this in the first chapter about spiritual pragmatism, about how the church's kind of own conception of itself has kind of lost its way and been secretistically assuming a lot of aspects of individualism. Like the church's job is to help you fulfill your God-given potential. No, the church's job is to exist for the glory of God and the good of neighbor. If you exist for the same reason in that church, you will find that much of your God-given potential is actually fulfilled, but it's not the potential that you think God gave you. It's the potential God actually gave you, which is to die to self, to live for others, and to worship God and to find our good in Him. And He'll bring us along in that, right? That is a different thing from the kind of marketplace logic that we've uncritically imbibed and brought into the church, and that's shaped us from having a kingdom logic, away from having a kingdom logic. So, I think there's a lot that, depending on where people are coming from and like their experience with church, if it includes church hurt or spiritual abuse, like each of those deserve a patient disentangling and processing of those experiences so that we can, bring the gospel story to bear on it within a church. But that's what a church is for, is actually to do that work and to come alongside people and point them to Jesus in their own story already, right? Because God is going before them. that we have
Right.
to assume that, right? But I would say that, like, to say that the church as an institution is good and necessary doesn't mean, that it's not a hospital for sinners, including ourselves. And of course it's messy, but in a lot of ways, another way of saying it's messy is that it's full of friction.
Right.
And just even being aware that some of our expectation of a frictionless church experience is not actually shaped by scripture or the ideals therein, but actually by our use of frictionless communication technology as a digital liturgy in every other moment of our life. So, yeah, I think at least when I've been able to point that out to people and say, like, what if we thought about belonging, not in the next, like, experiencing belonging, not in the next month or even the next year, but how about 5 years from now? Do you think
Right.
that's possible? Well, yeah, I
Right,
think
yeah.
it's possible. That's 5 years from now. I'm like,
Yeah, we've been kind of trained to be so impatient with everything, expect everything now. Yeah.
well, if every individual is finite, then every community is finite in terms of its ability to grow and to create a culture of belonging as well. And we're a church called The Table. So, like, hospitality and belonging is kind of like our thing. But it turns out that actually attracts a whole lot of people who long for it and have no experience in offering it. So, and myself included, right? Like, so we're all doing that. But, like, Jesus is big enough to more than bridge those gaps. And part of what you're doing in becoming a member of a church or committing to a church, saying, I'm not just going to belong. I don't want to just experience belonging within a church. I want to belong to a church. That does require faith. But you're putting your faith in a God who is more than capable of bridging that gap despite our messiness and frictionfulness along the way.
Right. Well, that's awesome. That's beautiful, man. I think it's a good place to stop. You want to let people know, remind us what the name of your book is and where they can find it, where they can find you on the internet.
Absolutely, yeah. The book is called The Reason for The book is called The Reason for Church: Why the Body of Christ Still Matters in an Age of Individualism, Anxiety, and Division. And you can find it on Amazon or any major booksellers. And I am on podcasts a lot, co-host Post Everything, where we're actually wrestling with a whole lot of these kind of cultural things that we've been talking about. Like, what does it look like to remap culture as the landscape underneath us has changed, and rethink what it looks like to pastor and lead in the midst of that. And so you can find us on Apple, Spotify, podcasts, and all that good stuff. So
great. Thanks, Brad. Glad to have you
so
today.
much.
We'll talk soon.
Thank you.